Well, I want to welcome everybody back to another episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamoni, and I'm an acceptance coach who helps people heal from grief, loss, and trauma to discover their self-acceptance and step into their personal power. This podcast is your dedicated space for healing, growth, and transformation. Each episode shares insightful and inspirational stories along with practical tools and actionable insights that can help guide you along your healing journey. Today, I have an awesome guest for you guys to hear. She's got a very powerful story. Her name is Andrea, and she's an alum of Les Brown. She's also the CEO of Press Play, Plan Life Accordingly to You, LLC. She's a coach, host of her own podcast, and a best-selling international author. She's a global ambassador as well and a global voice. She serves individuals who have felt abandoned, betrayed, and lost to help them take life's adversities to create their authenticity and our own identity. People who are already walking the path less traveled to take a life of a transformational journey to live the best life that they can have. Andrea, I want to welcome you onto the podcast.
Thank you so much, Chris, for having me. It's an honor and privilege to be here, truly.
It was awesome to meet you a few weeks back when we first connected. You
Yeah.
you said some very powerful things in the pre-recording that I'll eventually share with everybody. But I want to give you some space here to tell everybody a little bit about yourself and how you ended up in the place you are today, a little bit about your journey.
Absolutely. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Andrea Mason, your first choice, your global voice. So it started of finding that missing piece. You know, when you're looking to see where you are, that checked box, that group that you fit in, and you just can't quite find it. Well, that was me my whole life. I was born under the war-torn drug zone era at its prime of Colombia, South America at 11 pounds, 11 months old. And I was adopted and came to America to live with my American parents, and the journey has been amazing. I was a victim of abuse and bullying, and then I turned a life of vengeance to a life of victory. And I'm honored to share the story as we grow and go throughout this podcast. Thank you so much.
Well, Andrea, I heard a little bit about your story back when we first met, and I first off want to say, what was that like going from South America into America, being you were adopted, I'm guessing, through that
Yes,
process?
yes, correct. I was an adoptee and I came through an agency at 11 months old, weighing in at 11 pounds. So to recall back then is very bleak, but I just know I was welcomed with open arms and unconditional love. But as the story unravels, being the fact that I didn't have a lot of qualities and attributes of my parents, that's when the turn took a toll for if you will, for a lack of better phrase, of really stepping into learning who I am.
I think
Yeah,
that's a really big process that we all go through in life, to one degree or another. But I share
right.
your experience of I went through a lot of bullying in my life and a lot of trying to
Mhm.
figure out who the heck I was, and
Right,
I went through a lot of conformity in my life, people forcing me or trying to get me to change to make their life easy, and to
right.
become somebody to serve someone else. But I think through that process, though, we lose ourself and we lose our identity in the process, and so really discovering who we are is a very hard road when we start breaking down all that conditioning that we had. Share a little bit
Right.
about that process that you went through.
Yes. So, like I had mentioned, I was raised in an American family. So, being of Latina Hispanic descent, I didn't have the features of my American family of Irish and Italian descent. So, I felt comfortable because I was welcomed with unconditional love. But then as you grow older, you step outside in your comfort zone and in the community. And that's where life really smacked me in the face, if you will. I didn't look like my parents. I didn't have the attributes. And I remember in school kind of experiencing one of those projects that you had to do in school to kind of really learn about who you are, where I came from, my family tree. Well, mine was pretty much an olive branch, if you will, because I didn't have anything. I didn't have photographs of my biological parents, medical records, or anything really to kind of ground myself. So when we were doing it and I was putting up the pictures of my family, they were like, well, you don't look like them as much. And that was when I discovered the reality. Yes, I'm adopted. I was chosen and I was brought here to America. Well, then the kid said, well, if your parents didn't want you, how could you love? And that was a pivotal moment. That was a pivotal moment that, wow, all this unconditional love and nurturing within my family didn't emulate to the surroundings. So now I was looking for the check box that I fit in. in my school, in my sports, with amongst my peers, in my career, and in my relationships. And so that's where I really came and carved out my own, if you will. The American actor Matthew McConaughey says in one of his collegiate speeches, find out who you are not, and then you'll discover who you are. And so I realized I didn't want to live a life of vengeance. I didn't want to bully others. I didn't want to follow the masses. So I really kind of was learning about who I was. And my escape routes from bullying was that of athletics and music. My parents were gracious enough to allow me to learn how to play music at such a young age of 4 of the piano, and then go into athletics as an elementary years and going into soccer, football in European terms. And those were the outlets that I really delve into, not only to have fun, hence my business calling play, Plan Life According to You, but as outlets to really figure out who I was. Soccer to learn how to be a leader, learn how to be a team player, learn how to deal with loss. And music to understand that universal language of all the different frequencies that are embodied in, playing the piano. So that's where it stemmed from.
I really love that you played soccer because I did that too
Yeah.
growing up. And
Oh,
soccer is a
awesome.
very, I love soccer just because
Yeah.
it's globally accepted across so many cultures, so many diverse backgrounds, and then at the same
Right.
time, it creates this commonality for us to come together. And soccer in a lot of ways has individual attributes of it, but as a team collectively, that's where people win in that game. And so
Exactly.
it's almost like soccer kind of forces people to forget about their differences and come together
Hmm.
collectively to make a win happen.
Yes, it was that symbiotic relationship. I started off as starting off as, in the mid, the halfback section. That's the middle of the playing field, if you will. And then I would kind of circulate wherever. And then as I evolved as a player, then I went to striker, which was the front line, and started scoring goals. But that transition from center halfback to striker really shifts, because center halfback, you're kind of the quarterback, if you will, of football. You kind of really, you know, position the team where they need to be. And then a striker, you're kind of really closing the game, with potentially a score. Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you, because I was going through our notes when we first talked, and I know you had this growing up situation where you started trying to figure out, really who you're not to discover who you are.
Right.
And life kind of brought a lot of heaviness to you after that point.
Yes.
Lots of funerals I remember you talking about,
Yes.
seeing that
Yes.
other side of life that society kind of hides and buries and says don't talk about, or it's just
Right.
we don't discuss it or give it attention. Tell me a little bit about that chapter of your life.
Yes. So unfortunately, it started at age 13. And at the age 13, what other pivotal moment, especially in a girl growing up, is the hormones, the emotional, the body changes, the mentality, and everything with it. At age 13 was one of my first funerals I went to, of that of my paternal grandparents, within probably 2 weeks or so of each other. And ever since then, Chris, I was attending funerals. And like you said, media and your family is not really apt to say, hey, did you know about dying at such a young age? This is what the stages of grief and loss look like. And they don't really teach that in school. It's kind of like go through their emotions, because everybody deals with it in a certain way. So when I lost both my grandparents, paternal grandparents, at age 13, and it was just like it was confusing for me, because it was a reunion of all the family members, but at a somber moment. Back then it was a lot of tears shed, a lot of memories, a lot of talking about the ailments that the individual experienced and endured to bring to that stage of life. And at age 13, attempting to process that. I was one of probably 8 cousins, the only female. All my cousins were male. So I really didn't have that sisterhood or camaraderie of a female influence to really cope through it. And my mother and my grandmother were just like the embrace, nurturing kind. They would talk to me afterwards, but I didn't really have a support system in the moment, my age, to kind of really go through the motions. what they fail to tell you is grief has different stages, anger, denial, withdrawal, and so forth. But what they don't tell you is the underlying thread in most scenarios through grief is anger. Oh, she's
Mm.
depressed, she's isolated, or, let's go through it. And when I was going through the stages of the funeral after funerals, it started getting me frustrated. And I was just like, well, why is this happening all the time? What's going on? What can I do to change it? And you can't escape death. And so to go through that process, not only having several funerals year after year, but then, due to the support system on an other's plane of my peers, I went to private school, not by choice, by selection of my parents. But what I was able to gain in private school was understanding grief, the different processes and stages. And so if you're experiencing grief and loss out there, everybody copes with it differently. Some are introverts, they kind of bottle it up and really reserve it until they cry in the shower. I do. Or they journal, or they listen to music, or go for a walk. Some in unhealthy ways, self-medication. And I'm not talking about over the counter or prescription medications. I'm talking about eating or gambling or vices where they just want to get that instant gratification to subside that healing process. We're not equipped to it. And depending on the level of connectivity with the person who you've lost, really takes a toll on it. Fast forward, when I lost my mother, it was just unreal, to say the least.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that you hit on really well is the anger stage of grief, because a lot of people do get very angry, but society tells us a lot that anger is this really negative, bad thing. You shouldn't
Mhm.
be angry. You shouldn't feel
Right.
angry. And I found that going through the grief process myself, when I lost my grandfather and I lost my son, anger
Mhm.
really meant something different than anger. It wasn't this
Right.
negative big thing. And so
Mhm.
I've tried to share with people that I coach and go through the process with that anger is always a part of you that knows something's off, something's misunderstood, something's not being seen or heard. You've got an emotion or feeling you're not giving attention to. And
Exactly.
when you are in that angry state, you can actually see it.
Mhm.
You really can. But
Yeah.
you've got to have somebody or even yourself to be in that place to say, what's this trying to tell me? What's this trying to make me listen to? Is there a lesson I need to
Exactly.
learn? And when you
Yeah.
open yourself up beyond anger to see what that really is, and for me, I learned my anger was actually love. It was love without somewhere to
Mhm.
go. And
Yeah.
when I realized that, oftentimes my anger would last very, very short once I recognized that, because it was just a
Right.
stepping stone to that actual emotion. Anger wasn't the true emotion, first off emotion. It was the thing leading me to that emotion that was actually there in the background.
Mm. Right. And I think that's a lot of things that people don't realize is when you're short with someone, when you take it out on something, I say, in order to heal, you must feel. Let your emotions go through you. Allow them to come to fruition. Be mindful if you're able to tame them, but also make it a point throughout your day, throughout your week, or throughout your life to really address it. Because what happens is an innocent bystander is that receives the repercussions of that anger. I can't tell you how many times I get angry, but what happens, I start crying. And then people are like, "Oh, are you okay?" And I'm just like, I am so enraged right now that that's the way I show anger. I may yell, I may get upset, but when I get to the point of anger where tears come out, it's real deep rooted that there's something else not being addressed, like you said. And I remember doing an exercise with someone. They said, well, have you really dealt with the losses in your life? Not done it, And have you went through all the stages? Yeah, I've went through it. And then, you know, they say what I work with people is the healing power of forgiveness is to achieve personal freedom. Forgive yourself for putting you in this mental state for this long. But what you must do before that is release the anger in a healthy, strategic way that works best for you. Because at any given moment. If anger is not treated, it's triggered. And we don't know the level that has been bottled up and suppressed because it will take you out regardless.
You brought up a big topic that's not really discussed much in society, which is the
Mhm.
idea and the concept of self-forgiveness. And that's something
Right,
that on my personal journey, I had a lot of anger when I lost my son, and I had a lot of other life issues I'll go into in another episode happening
right.
all when that happened. But I got to a
Hmm.
place, like you just said, that anger almost reached a peak. It reached a pinnacle
Hmm.
where it just couldn't go anywhere at that point. And
Right.
I started sitting there saying, how can I navigate this? How can I do this better?
Hmm.
How can I work through this? Because I said
Right.
I can no longer sit with it because it's such a hard emotion. And I
Right.
came across self-forgiveness, and then I started sitting there
Yes.
saying, I look back on that moment and I started saying, what are some things that were going on that caused this anger to happen? And when I got to that
Mm.
place of saying, instead of blaming other people, which, true,
Right.
there were some things that went on with other family members that contributed to
Right.
things. I sat there and said, what did I tolerate and allow? What did I put myself in situation with? And what was really interesting about this
Hmm.
self-forgiveness perspective is that the anger towards other people got very, very quiet. It was very interesting.
Hmm.
And then what actually happened was I started taking massive ownership. And I'm not going to say this is easy, by the way, because it's really hard to
Right.
look at yourself and say, oh, this is
Yeah.
my contribution to things.
Right.
But
Right.
I learned through that exercise that it brought you to this high level of ownership and this self-respect for yourself. And
Hmm.
when you got to that place, you stepped into your own personal power. You stopped giving it away to everything and everyone around you. You brought it back into yourself. And
Right.
it created this place for me that I was able to then say, I have a choice. I have a decision I can
Hmm.
make. I can do
Right.
things differently. I don't have to do
Right.
this. And
Right.
all of a sudden, the anger started going away. And what was really funny about it is it became a
Hmm.
source of empowerment. It became a source of
Right.
drive.
Hmm.
I was going to ask you, how's that looked like when you've helped people through that process of self-forgiveness? Have you seen that journey and transformation with them?
Yes, absolutely. And what the amazing discovery, Chris, that I've spoken with people as well as my own personal journey was this anger, these illusions, if you were, to us were really delusions. It was really looking at the situation to be something more greater or more negative than it really was because of the suppressed emotions. For example, I remember I was working with someone and they were very upset with their parents. And they said, I can't even fathom the situation that had occurred to them and so forth. So when we started walking on the journey with them, we started peeling apart the layers. And as we were peeling apart the layers, getting to the root cause, reflecting and eliminating all judgment and going back to that situation, we then realized what was thought to have occurred with that individual never happened. It was the person's perspective and interpretation of either a statement or a behavior that was brought to them. And so for decades, they were under this impression that their parents said this, believed them about this, and treated them this way. But when we stop and reflected, it was them creating this false delusion because they were angry with the parent, but the parent never did those things. They created it and made things up because of the action or statement that was stated. So this is very key for those individuals who are going through the healing process. If you're not facing your past will chase you, and sometimes it will intertwine into your emotions of loss and grief and add on illusions or delusions that may have occurred that was conceived in your mind, but not a reality.
That's a really fascinating breakthrough that you've had because I
Yeah.
think we all,
Yeah.
depending on our emotional state that we end up in, when we
Hmm.
are in heavy emotions like grief and anger, our brain wants to go to survival mode. So
Yes.
sometimes we perceive, like you said, illusions and delusions. They
Hmm.
happen, and it's not because we forced it to happen, but our brain perceived something as either a threat or not safe or something other than the context in which an event happened. And so,
Right.
but it can be very hard, by the way, when we are in
Oh
those
yeah.
emotions and our brain is doing this thing. It can be very hard for us to be what I like to call the observer of our life, pulling ourselves up
Yes.
out of that situation and saying, I'm back here looking down on this. And what am I
Right.
seeing between myself and this person? What's really happening?
Right. Yes, getting to the root cause, because there is a difference between perception and perspective. One looks at the senses. What do you actually see? I see Chris right now wearing a green hoodie with black text and a library, behind him, like a book, a bunch of books behind him. But, I can perceive, well, he's an avid reader. He's very intellectual and, he likes being comfortable as he reads. But then perception is maybe he doesn't like to read. Maybe he's just putting that for, whatever the reason. So you have to really be mindful of one way of looking at things through the five or six senses that you utilize, and then compare it to what you internalize, experience, and using your emotions, because they're two different things. And if you're not clear with individuals, what I call about effective communication and listening and reflective communication and listening, is you may interpret somebody's emotions or body language or tonality in a certain way. But if you haven't adjusted your frequency, per se, you may correlate that individual with someone who's done you harm or somebody who's done you well. And depending on which side it is, that's going to make you react a certain way to them because of your past if you haven't faced it.
You're reminding me with what you just said a lot about triggers in life, and I think
Hmm.
that triggers, as I've come to learn on my healing journey, has been we have things that happen in our past, things that
Right.
we may have tolerated and allowed too much, and we actually were bothered back then by what happened, but we never stood up and had a
Hmm.
voice to say we didn't like that, or set a boundary with somebody and say we don't tolerate that, we don't like that.
Yes.
And so sometimes we end up way later on in life over here that one person over here does one thing that looked like something back here in the past, and all of a
Yes.
sudden there's 5 or 10 years or 20 years worth of triggers that come flying up in this one moment. And it's not always what that person said in the moment to you, it's that past stuff that happened.
Correct.
How do we navigate that? That's
Mm.
a very tricky thing for a lot of people.
Right. And it's as easy as taking a deep breath, 3 seconds. Let's, and we all know this, let's respond as opposed to react. How many times have you gone into a space where you're walking into a public place and somebody's doing one of your pet peeves, whether that's talking loud on their phone, chewing with with their mouth open, or just tapping a desk, tapping their hand against the desk? Are you going to go into reactive mode and address it in an uncivil manner? Or are you going to say, all right, deep sigh, and say, is it really worth my time? Your parents teach you, choose your battles, because that's the key component, which you said, Chris, is we have a chance and a choice in life. And we must be accountable for each one every single moment, because if we don't, then there's no reason to blame others. We have to take personal accountability. And that's another realm that I help individuals really hone into, because we want to point the finger, but if we're pointing the finger every single time, then it's not that person, it's us. You know what I mean? We're the same character in the same story, the character, but the audience has changed. So we really have to be mindful of our way we show up, the way we present ourselves, and as the old school says, leave your emotions at the door, depending where you are, or be prepared that, hey, my emotions are who I am, that's how I am, and people may deflect my emotions or reflect my emotions. We have to be prepared for that as well.
That's a very interesting perspective you just brought up, because that's the first time I've heard that phrase been used, that people will either reflect or deflect our emotions. I think
Right.
that's a very profound statement and a different
Mhm.
perspective to look at, because
Yeah.
as we go through life, and I've lived a life where I've been very misunderstood by
Mhm.
99% of people in my life. I've
Right.
been
Right here.
blamed and judged and all sorts of stuff, and I was in that victim space for a very long time. I did all
Right.
those things reacting, and I I lashed out at people, I'll admit that. But
Hmm.
now I'm in a place after going through this grief journey where something
Hmm.
shifted in me. I don't really know what it
Yeah.
was, but I started to really hone in on that space that, one of my
Right.
therapists I talked to many years ago said the difference between what triggers us and that outcome that we have, there's a very small space in between that where we have a
Right.
choice. And a lot of
Right.
times we skip over it because that emotion that we feel is so strong. And
Right.
when you said deflecting or reflecting emotion, other people, I thought
Hmm.
really hard about what you said because a lot of
Hmm.
times we want to express ourselves in the inappropriate way, by the way. And we might say, hey, that really hurt me the way you said something, or that was really
Right.
offensive to me as I'm going through this grief process. And somebody might tell
Right.
you things like, well, grief is a part of life. Get over it, accept it.
Right.
And that can be
Right.
really hard to hear. But
Right.
when we take that personal ownership, when we hear that, instead of saying,
Hmm.
engaging in a fight with that person and saying, how dare you say that? That was wrong. How, you can't think that way. Instead, if we turn into ourselves and we say, this person didn't have my experience. This person doesn't know
Yeah.
how I feel. This
Right.
person isn't responsible for my emotions and how I feel. And if I let them
Right.
go, I still get to have those things. It never got taken away
Right.
in the first place.
Yes.
So you end up in that place of power. So when you can see, the reception or deception of those emotions from other people. It's almost like giving your power back to yourself in that moment.
Yeah. Right. And it's not easy. Like Chris said, it's not easy. It's really taking that 1 to 3 seconds deep breath. Is this helpful? Is this harmful? Is this hurtful? You know what I mean? Or just saying, all right, well, that's who they are, and they talk about in the four agreement, well, there's five agreements, but the four key ones: don't take anything personal. You be impeccable with your word. Don't take anything personal. Do your best. And the other one, it's escaping me. Well, it'll come back to me. But it's talking about that because we have to take accountability for who we are. And don't judge others, I think, is the other one, I believe. You could correct me if I'm wrong, but those are the key points. But I mean, if you think about it, we don't know what other people go through, and we have to keep reminding ourselves, as well as just today's day and age, we're not mind readers. How many of us get frustrated with our loved ones, our family, our friends, especially in the elder age, if you're on the phone and the grandparent asks the same question 5 times. What I have learned to do and adopted is we really don't have a long time here. We really don't, if you look at it. Because if you really wanted to break down the lifespan of a human being, first 10 years are all trial and error. Next 10 years are fitting in. Next 10 years are establishing who we are, creating our identity. And the next 30 is wishing that we apply those tools, lessons, and losses and living it out. And when you think of it, what I started doing was, because I've attended so many funerals, is looking at the legacy they leave behind. What were they here for? What was the initial relationship that brought them into my life? And what footprint did they leave on my heart? And what can I adopt to carry out their legacy? And that is the light that leads me forward into maybe bypassing or softening the experience of anger, frustration, and loss. Yes, they're physically not here, but I'm a diehard Disney fan, as you can see,
I love
is,
that.
Coco, remember me. Because once we forget those who've gone beyond, they're no longer here, literally. And so we have to look at death as the next phase of life. But what is Greg Plitt, very famous motivational speaker, as well as I believe, athletic trainer. He says you only have one life, but if you live it right, that's all you need. And so when we're looking at the losses of our pets, our children, our family members, our friends, influencers, to carry you and cushion the stages of grief that you'll go through, bring light into that journey. What have you learned from them? What have you learned not to do? What have you learned to do? And what legacy do you want to carry out with them? Because we don't know when that golden ticket is when we take that next journey. But what do we want to leave as our legacy going forward? And that has really shifted the anger and frustration. It's still there, but not as bold, abrasive, and aggressive.
Actually, something you hit on about talking about legacy and working through that anger and having it be lessened. One of the big things I learned after I lost my grandfather is I got this perspective from one of my coaches, and he said, always look at the gifts, the lessons, and the blessings of these moments. Because when
Hmm.
you're in that deep anger, it'll destroy and take away and prevent you from seeing those things, by the way.
Right.
And he said that's
Hmm.
not to discredit, by the way, how painful something might be. It's not to do that.
Right.
But it's to
Right.
say that we always have an opportunity in our life to learn. If it's a gift, it's giving something to us. If it's a
Right.
horrible experience, it's a lesson we're learning. Um,
Exactly.
a blessing, by the way, is just a miracle of life, as I like to call it. I mean,
Right.
I look back when my grandfather passed and I say, it was a gift. It was a blessing that he left the world because he was fighting terminal
Hmm.
cancer, going through a lot of pain
Right.
and suffering. And so it was a blessing he got to pass on. I feel great that he doesn't have to suffer anymore. And,
Right.
the lesson for me was I had to become my own rock in life. I had to learn how to live this life without a fallback because he's not here
Right.
anymore. So I had to then think about all the gifts that he gave me over 30 years with him. And so
Mm.
this anger that I had transmuted into celebration. It transmuted
Right.
into when I'm reminded of him, I make jokes like he would make jokes. I say his
Right.
jokes to myself. And that
Right.
anger of losing him slowly got quiet. It doesn't mean it comes
Right.
up every now and then. It does. Same
Sure.
thing with my son, but it's very, very
Hmm.
quiet because I've replaced it
Right.
with celebration of life and celebration of that legacy that you were talking about. And I think that
Yeah.
that's a very individual journey, by the way. I don't expect people that just lost somebody to say, "Oh, I'm going to go find the gifts and blessings today."
Yeah.
Um,
No.
I'm saying that eventually when you work to that place, you'll find it and you'll see
Right.
how beautiful that is, and that anger will go away. It'll be very quiet.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I came across something a couple of weeks, maybe a month ago. Time is flying nowadays for me. It's like yesterday was 2024. So it's crazy, but there was a article or a quote of some sort saying that, you know, oh my gosh, it just went out of my head. Really? Um, man. We're talking about legacy and everything, and we were talking about the power of unconditional love and taking it back and the anger. And okay, we're gonna have to come back to it because it just literally left my mind just now. So we'll come back to it.
You know what my grandfather used to say about that? This was one
Yeah.
of his like awesome things because he was get really forgetful as his older years went on. Things would just like leave the
Hmm.
mind. And we got to that place of saying that if you don't think about it anymore and you just let go and move, it comes right back to you for some
It
reason. And I don't know
it
why.
just got back. So thank you to your grandfather. It just came back. So thanks. So yeah, so if we look at the next transition in life, one of the perspectives that was stated was that you're chosen right before your ultimate suffering. And you had brought that to your grandfather living with the condition, and it wasn't healthy and profitable for anyone going through that. And he's no longer suffering. And so that was really important read that I came across recently that, you know, don't look at it as like an unfortunate circumstance, which it is, but also look at it as it's it was their time before anything else traumatic, dramatic, or worse could happen. Like they kind of like it was kind of interpreted like they grabbed you right before suffering, the ultimate suffering, that and I was just like, that's really powerful, that for people who are living with conditions of medical conditions or, you know, injuries of some sort that there's no need for pain anymore, and then they kind of know, you know what I mean. I've been around the block to really know, and I've adopted and actually adapted my empathy frequency where I'll never forget. a situation where we're on a family vacation, and all of a sudden I was just like, oh my gosh. And I picked up the phone and I called my family member and I said, is everything okay? I said, did so and so? And they said, they just crossed over. I was like, so I was like, I wasn't even thinking of that person, nothing. All of a sudden, we were getting on the train to go elsewhere. And then I just felt that energy of that person. And then I called their family member and they said, oh, yes, they just crossed over. So you can look at it as an opportunity to really tap in. We all have these abilities to really tap into our higher frequency and senses to say they're safe now, they're no longer suffering. Whether, and it doesn't even have to be a medical or injury condition. It could be just a broken heart or really not feeling whole 100% of themselves.
I
Yeah.
think you hit on something really powerful that my coach told me years ago, and it's something to do with suffering that you brought up, that being empathic and feeling that energy, and
Yeah.
something that I learned, and it's kind of ties into Miguel Ruiz. I don't know if you've read his books before, but
Yes, yes, he
you
does
have
the four agreements and the fifth agreement. Yes,
have
Don
you
Miguel Ruiz. Yes, I've
he's
listened
one
to all of them.
he's one of my
He's a
favorite.
friend on my Facebook.
I love that. He's one of my favorite authors because he has
Yes,
short books that are easy to read, quick to read, but
yes.
they're so powerful
Oh my
in their
gosh, yes,
messaging.
yes,
He read a book, wrote a book about the five attachments, and I don't know if you've read
yes.
that one yet. Um,
I listened to the audio. My comprehension and reading level isn't intact because every time I open a book, I'll fall asleep. So, but I did listen to the audio book of that. Amazing read. If you guys read or catch the audio book, plug, definitely.
I highly recommend this book
Yes.
because I have to preface, his grandmother is a shaman in South America. And so
Hmm.
he picked up a lot of these lessons from his grandma. It's such a phenomenal guy. Just go read his books. They're awesome.
Yes.
But when we go through grief and loss, something that, I got told was that our suffering that we feel, all our anger and all that, is taking on someone else's experience. And I was
Yes.
really angry when I heard this because I was right in the middle of a loss that just happened within 30 days.
Right.
So it was really hard to hear
Right.
this. But
Right.
when I thought about this perspective, I said, my grandfather passing or my son passing, that was their experience. It wasn't mine. It was their
Right.
experience of life. Now,
Yes.
my attachment to that, by the way, is me creating my own suffering because I feel like I
Yes.
lost something. Something was taken away
Hmm.
from me. I don't get it anymore.
Hmm.
And so actually inflicting my own pain because I'm taking on someone else's experience. And
Yes.
the reason I bring up Miguel Ruiz's book, The Five Attachments, is he talks about this soccer game and he talks about how
Hmm.
if you show up to the soccer game just as an observer, you're not rooting for any team, you're not buying the sports
Right.
memorabilia, you're strictly just showing up. You don't care if the ref makes a bad call, you don't care who
Right.
wins, you don't pay attention to that. You just say, this was a really fun game to watch, and I had a great time watching this.
Right.
You
Right.
don't have any suffering and attachment to that situation. You're just observing it and experiencing it in full for what it is. And then he uses this example that if you're a person that goes, wearing body paint, face mask, and you're yelling at the ref, you're mad at fans that aren't as
Yep.
passionate as you start yelling at
Yep.
the other team that lost or won because you don't like how someone played. He said, you talk about all this energy you take on in that attachment space, and what happens
Hmm.
is that you've now taken on things that are not even yours. You're not even playing on
Right.
the field, by the way, but you're
Right.
really
Right.
upset because you lost. And
Right.
then he said, you're getting mad at all these people around you because they're not as impassioned as you are. And so he
Hmm.
talked a lot about how, and I related this to grief a lot when I read his book, that when we attach ourselves so hard to that experience of losing someone and we
Yeah.
start taking on all that pain and suffering that they went through, we almost take away our own experience because of our attachment to things. And I thought
Yeah.
it was such a powerful lesson that he shared in that book. And that's why I encourage
Mm.
everybody to read it. Um,
Yeah.
and by the way, it's not to say that you're going to lose somebody and say, okay, well, I just experienced it and that's fine.
No.
I'm not
Right.
saying that, but I'm saying be mindful in that moment to know that you're having your own experience of what is happening in front of you. That person
Hmm.
you lost, by the way, is having their own experience. And when you
Right.
give yourself the space to have your own experience with that and not take on somebody else's, you actually can take a lot out of that situation. Like Andrea's been saying today in the podcast
Yeah.
about what's this legacy they left behind? What are these
Right.
celebrations and gifts they've given us? And you then
Right.
think about the footprint they left on your heart.
Right.
And this can really help alleviate a lot of suffering and a lot of anger and a lot of pain when you can
Hmm.
get to that space of not attaching yourself so strongly to it.
And I love you mentioned that. I want to be mindful of time, but I would love that you mentioned that because when I lost my mother in 2007, I adapted and adopted all of the pain and suffering and trials and tribulations she's endured. And just shy of a decade later, I was lying on fighting for my life in the ICU unit in 2016, fighting for my life because I suppressed and pushed down all the energy. No, I'm just going to go right to work. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to move about it. It didn't happen. Denial, anger, just didn't care, isolated, lone wolf. Sadness. I would just cry in the shower. I would just go, cry myself to sleep. And all of those actions, reactions, and negative responses, like like I died, put me to that point of fighting for my life. And that's what it can do, ladies and gentlemen. If we don't address it, not that you're going to be in the ICU unit, please don't take that message away. But if we don't face our emotions will chase us and diminishes us. Because you have to, as I mentioned in the beginning of the segment, you have to feel in order to heal. And it's really a process. Take time. There's no cookie cutter way, but allow yourself to understand and educate yourself about the stages of grief. Allow yourself to have a strong support system and do the activities that are helpful and not hurtful. Absolutely.
I think that's really powerful. And I wanted to build on what Andrea just said, by the way. Emotions are messages. They're not this
Hmm.
physical, tangible thing that people
Right.
say, control your emotions. I always put my hand up on my podcast, say, guys,
Yeah.
there's no emotion here, nothing. It's all
Right.
here. And
Right.
so,
Yes.
the powerful thing I've learned in my journey, and I help people see it through coaching sessions, is they'll come to me with strong emotions. I'll even deal with people that are very, very angry. And when I
Right.
ask them a powerful question, what's that anger trying to tell you? What's that sadness
Right.
trying to tell you? What's the
Right.
message you need to hear? And I always
Right.
have people look at me really funny and they go, what are you talking about? And I said, don't
Right.
control it right now. Let it happen. And
Yes.
when they do let it happen, by the way, like I said, it oftentimes comes out not in, I'm angry, I'm pissed. It comes out in, I'm really sad, I'm really
Hurt.
hurt, I'm
Yeah.
really sad.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
what you see a
Absolutely.
lot of times is when you let that happen, the tension you feel in your body just dissipates because
Yes.
you let that message flow through you. And
Absolutely.
that's where you can really find the power of healing. As you said, you start to heal when
Yes.
you start to feel.
Hmm.
That's where it starts because when you
Yes.
acknowledge your feelings, you're taking all that energy out of yourself. You're giving it
Right.
space. You're making it feel seen and heard and understood. And that's what all of us want,
Yeah.
by the way. A shocking story. We all want those things.
Yeah.
So I would say give
Absolutely.
yourself permission to feel. Give yourself
Yeah.
permission.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Excellent. Excellent.
So, Andrea, as we wrap up the podcast, I always ask my guests this question at the end of the show. If you were to run into somebody today who is going through grief or feels stuck in grief, what are one or two things you would share with them to help them navigate that journey just a little bit easier?
Yes, absolutely. So, two takeaways. The first, as Chris and I had mentioned, follow your heart, not the herd nor the hurt, for joyfulness is on the other side. Why do I say that? Because if you follow your heart, you're going to allow the emotions to flow and be genuine and authentic with what you're really feeling. This going away from the herd, what society tells us of grief, especially as men. Oh, suck it up, your boys don't cry, be a man about it. Allow yourself to feel, to be human. We're all human. And the hurt, it can take you to places. So acknowledge this is what I'm hurting about, and how can I help my way through the process? So follow your heart, not the herd nor the hurt. Secondly, know that anything you've gone through, you have the opportunity and choice to help others achieve it too. If you've gone through loss or grief out there, reach out to somebody, see how they're doing. I can't tell you how many times I just reach out to people on social media or in person because I can feel that energy. How are you doing? And I'll sit there sometimes in silence with them and just breathe for a few moments. Sit there and smile, sit there and cry, or I'll ask them to tell them a positive memory of that person. And usually that helps them heal through the process. Back to you.
So, Andrea, I want to leave all of our listeners who've enjoyed this podcast today. Where can they connect with you online? Where can they find you?
Absolutely. You can find me right here, AndreaMasons.com, my website. I'm on all social media platforms, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube. And I also have my own website, AndreaMasons.com, where you can find Victim to Victorious, because a lot of in that book is the healing process journey of not only loss of my mother, loss of a job, loss of a friend, loss of a family member, but most importantly, I was really lost in my identity. So I was able to go from vengeance to victory. So I welcome your connection. Absolutely. Thank you.
That's really beautiful, Andrea. I want to thank you for being a guest on the Empower Grief Journey podcast. You're now a member of this collective because
Yes,
you've
thank
shared
you.
such a beautiful story of going through all
Thank
those
you.
hardships and navigating all those losses in your life and finding meaning and purpose, and more importantly, rediscovering who you are. And now you get to share that beautiful gift with the world. So I just want to say thank you.
Absolutely. Yes, and also for those, if you email me at am.pressplay@yahoo.com, I'll provide you a download of a cheat sheet, some tips that I use in the acronym of play of healing through the power of grief. Achieving personal freedom through the healing power of grief and forgiveness. I'll be able to do that. So just email me with this segment and I'll get that to your inbox.
I love that. Thank you for offering that to my listeners today. I
Yes,
want to
absolutely.
thank all of you guys who have listened to this podcast. Thank you for joining Andrea and I today on this episode of the Empower Grief Journey. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with somebody you know that could benefit from Andrea's story. The Empower Grief Journey is all about honoring your journey, embracing your emotions, and finding strength in your own time. I want to invite you guys to follow other episodes of this podcast at empowergriefjourney.com. I want you to know you're never alone on this journey, and together we can navigate grief with courage and compassion. Until next time, be kind to yourself and take your grief journey one step at a time.